From the outside, the Campbell estate in Greenwich, Connecticut looked like a palace. Its towering columns, the perfectly trimmed hedges, and the marble floors that gleamed under imported chandeliers gave the impression of a flawless world. To the neighbors and business partners of Richard Campbell, a billionaire known for his empire in finance and real estate, it seemed like a fairy tale life. A widower at 45, respected and sometimes feared in the boardroom, Richard appeared to have built a life of order and prestige. But behind those polished walls lived a fragile truth no amount of money could hide. His 78-year-old mother, Margaret Campbell, was slipping deeper into the fog of Alzheimer's. Some mornings she would greet Richard as if he were her late husband. On others, she wandered the house confused, clutching old photo albums and asking when her parents were coming home. The illness stole her memories little by little, but one thing still sparked light in her eyes: Grace Johnson. Grace, 42, worked as the housekeeper, though her role in the Campbell household went far beyond dusting and polishing. A single mother who had endured her share of hardship, she carried a quiet strength that money couldn't buy. Grace understood Margaret in ways no one else did. She would sit with her for hours, listening to stories repeated 100 times. She helped her dress, brushed her hair, and when the nights brought confusion and fear, Grace held her hand until the tremors subsided. To Margaret, Grace wasn't just the help, she was comfort, she was family. On her worst days, she even called Grace "my daughter," and Grace, with tears in her eyes, would simply smile and whisper back, "I'm right here, and I'm not going anywhere." But not everyone in the mansion felt compassion. Vanessa Moore, Richard's 32-year-old fiancée, saw Margaret as nothing more than a burden. Young, beautiful and polished, Vanessa was admired at every gala she attended with Richard. To the public, she was the perfect partner, stylish, poised, and endlessly supportive. Yet when Richard wasn't around, the mask fell. Behind the designer gowns and rehearsed smiles, Vanessa's patience gave way to disdain. Grace saw it all. At first, she tried to excuse Vanessa's sharp tone or cold gestures as fatigue, but it became impossible to ignore the cruelty. When Richard left for business meetings, Vanessa's tenderness evaporated. She would roll her eyes at Margaret's confusion, snatch objects from her hands, and mutter under her breath about how embarrassing the old woman was becoming. One afternoon, Margaret shuffled into the sitting room, holding a faded photograph of her husband. Her cloudy eyes glistened as she whispered, "He promised he'd be back to take me dancing tonight. I should get ready." Grace was about to answer when Vanessa swept into the room in her heels, arms folded, her voice like ice. "Margaret, your husband has been dead for 40 years. Stop talking nonsense." The words landed like a slap. Margaret's trembling hands clutched the photo as her eyes filled with tears. She shrank into the chair, as if ashamed of her own memory. Grace, carrying a tray of tea, hurried to her side. "Mrs. Campbell, let's sit together and have some tea. He always loved tea, didn't he?" Margaret's face brightened slightly at the kindness. Vanessa, irritated, crossed her arms tighter. "You treat her like a child. She needs to face reality." "No," Grace replied gently but firmly. "What she needs is kindness." The air in the room turned heavy. Margaret leaned into Grace's touch, her fragile smile returning. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. In that moment, Grace realized the truth. Vanessa wasn't merely impatient, she resented Margaret. To her, the old woman was an obstacle between her and the luxurious future she envisioned. Richard, meanwhile, remained oblivious. Whenever he was home, Vanessa played her part flawlessly. She cooed over Margaret, held her hand at dinner, and complimented her outfits with sugary sweetness. Richard believed he had found a woman both beautiful and compassionate, and Grace, humble as she was, did not dare challenge him. But with every passing day, the tension in the mansion grew. The turning point came during a dinner party. Richard had invited close friends and business associates to impress them with the grandeur of his estate. Vanessa orchestrated everything down to the last crystal glass. Dressed in red silk, she greeted guests with the charm of a practiced hostess. Down the hall, Margaret sat quietly in an armchair, staring at an old album. Grace stayed close, knowing the commotion unsettled her. When the guests gathered in the main hall, Margaret rose and approached a distinguished visitor. Her frail voice trembled. "William, you came back. I knew you would." The room went silent. The man she spoke to, startled, gave a polite smile. Richard cleared his throat. "It's the illness," he explained softly. "Sometimes she confuses people." The guests nodded, some with pity, others with discomfort. Vanessa, however, seized the opportunity to humiliate. "Mrs. Campbell, please sit down. You're disrupting the reception," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the room. Margaret froze, confused, as her eyes filled with tears. Grace rushed to her side. "Come with me, Mrs. Campbell. Let's sit somewhere quieter. You're fine." Guests exchanged uneasy glances. A few frowned at Vanessa's tone. Margaret clung to Grace's hand, whispering softly, "Don't leave me." Grace's heart clenched. "I'll never leave you," she promised. The evening continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Richard noticed it in passing, but dismissed it as tension from hosting. Vanessa smiled as though nothing had happened, but her eyes flashed daggers at Grace whenever no one was watching. Later that night, Margaret wandered the halls, frightened by shadows only she could see. "Where is my husband?" "He said he'd be here," she murmured. Vanessa lost her patience. Grabbing her arm roughly, she hissed, "Stop it! You're nothing but a nuisance." Grace ran in at the sound of Margaret's cry. She froze at the sight, Vanessa's fingers digging into the old woman's fragile arm, Margaret trembling in terror. "Let her go!" Grace commanded, stepping forward with fire in her eyes. Vanessa's mouth twisted in disbelief. "How dare you speak to me like that? You're just the help." Grace didn't flinch. "I may be the help, but I know the difference between right and wrong, and what you're doing is cruel." Margaret collapsed into Grace's embrace, sobbing like a child. Vanessa stood rigid, rage simmering beneath her polished exterior. She leaned close, her voice a venomous whisper. "You'll regret this, I promise." Grace held Margaret tighter, her heart pounding. She knew she had crossed a dangerous line, but she also knew she couldn't remain silent anymore. She had become the shield between a defenseless woman and the cruelty of someone who claimed to love her. What Grace didn't know was that the walls of the Campbell mansion had ears. And soon the truth would explode in ways none of them could control. If you want to know how Richard uncovers the truth about the woman he thought he loved, and how Grace's courage changes everything, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part of this story. The following days at the Campbell estate unfolded like a play in which every actor knew their part, except Richard. He was buried in meetings, calls, and deals, convinced that Vanessa managed the household with grace, while Grace managed the chores with quiet diligence. But beneath the veneer of elegance, the tension thickened like a storm building on the horizon. Grace continued to protect Margaret as best she could. Every morning she found ways to distract her, bringing tea, humming old songs, or guiding her gently through the house. Margaret's fragile world made sense only when Grace was near. Yet whenever Vanessa appeared, the light in Margaret's eyes dimmed. One afternoon, Grace was folding linens in the laundry room when she overheard a conversation from the hallway. Vanessa's voice was low but sharp, like glass cutting through air. "You're ruining everything, Margaret. You make Richard pity you, and I'm sick of it. Do you even know how much harder you make my life?" Grace's hands froze over the fabric. She leaned closer to the door, heart pounding. Margaret's trembling voice answered, "I don't mean to cause trouble, I forget things." "You forget everything," Vanessa snapped. "One of these days I'll make sure you're not around to embarrass me anymore." Grace's blood ran cold. She burst through the doorway. Vanessa stepped back, startled, her mask slipping for a fraction of a second before she plastered on a smirk. "Eavesdropping, Grace. How very unprofessional." "I wasn't eavesdropping," Grace said firmly. I was making sure Mrs. Campbell was safe." "Safe?" Vanessa's laughter was hollow. "She's delusional. I'm the one who has to put up with her endless rambling. You should be grateful Richard even keeps you around. Do you think he'll take your side if you try to challenge me?" Grace clenched her fists but remained calm. "Mrs. Campbell deserves dignity. If you can't give it, then at least step aside and let me care for her properly." Vanessa's eyes narrowed. "You're walking a dangerous line." She turned on her heel and stormed away, leaving Grace trembling but resolute. That evening, Margaret suffered another episode. She wandered into the grand dining hall, clutching an old scarf she believed belonged to her late husband. Vanessa hissed with irritation as she guided Richard's business partners through the house. "Margaret, go upstairs. You're embarrassing everyone." Before Grace could intervene, Margaret tripped on the edge of the rug. The scarf flew from her hands as she stumbled toward the marble floor. Gasps filled the room. Richard caught her just in time, his arms steadying her frail body. "Mother, are you all right?" he asked, alarm in his voice. Margaret's lips trembled. "He said he would come for me. I was waiting." Richard's eyes softened with pain. He turned to Vanessa, who stood frozen with a smile too tight to be sincere. "You could have helped her," he said sharply. Vanessa's cheeks flushed crimson. I didn't realize." Grace knelt beside Margaret, retrieving the scarf. She wrapped it gently around her shoulders. "You're safe now. Let's get you to your room." That night, when the guests had gone and silence settled over the mansion, Richard confronted Vanessa in the library. The fire crackled, casting long shadows across the bookshelves. "What happened earlier? Why did you speak to my mother like that?" Vanessa, sitting elegantly with a glass of wine, tried to laugh it off. "Richard, she confused everyone. I was only trying to spare you the embarrassment." "Embarrassment?" Richard's voice grew hard. "She's my mother, Vanessa. If you can't treat her with respect, then perhaps you don't belong here." The glass trembled slightly in Vanessa's hand, but she quickly recovered. "You're overreacting. You're stressed from work, and she's deteriorating. I was only doing what's best for both of us." Richard's jaw tightened, but before he could answer, Margaret's cries echoed from upstairs. He left the library without another word. Grace was already there, calming Margaret, who clutched the bedsheets as if the darkness itself threatened her. Richard watched from the doorway as Grace whispered softly, stroking her hair. Margaret's sobs quieted, her breathing steadied, and soon she was asleep. Grace stayed seated, her hand resting gently on the old woman's frail fingers. Richard lingered, silent. Something inside him shifted. He had seen his fiancée's impatience and his housekeeper's compassion in the same night, and the contrast was impossible to ignore. The following days revealed even more cracks. Margaret's episodes grew more frequent, and each time Grace shielded her while Vanessa's irritation boiled closer to the surface. One afternoon, Richard overheard Grace singing to his mother in the garden. Margaret swayed gently to the tune, her face alight with childlike joy. From the patio, Richard watched unseen. Grace's voice wasn't polished, but it carried warmth that filled the air. Vanessa appeared suddenly, her heels clicking on the stone path. "What is this, a concert?" she sneered. "She looks ridiculous out here." Margaret flinched, her joy collapsing. Grace's expression hardened. "She's happy. Why would you take that from her?" "Because it makes us look foolish," Vanessa snapped. "Neighbors could see. Do you want them gossiping about the Campbell family?" Richard stepped forward then, no longer able to remain silent. "Enough, Vanessa," he said, his tone sharp as steel. Vanessa froze, startled. She stammered an excuse, but Richard ignored her. He bent down, picking a small flower from the edge of the garden and handing it to his mother. Margaret's face brightened again. Grace watched quietly, her chest heavy with relief. That night, Richard sat in his study, staring at a glass of bourbon he hadn't touched. His thoughts were a storm. Vanessa's cruelty, Grace's courage, his mother's fragile trust, everything collided in his mind. He had prided himself on control, but control had slipped through his fingers. He realized he had been blind, and for the first time in years, he questioned whether he truly knew the woman he intended to marry. Vanessa, meanwhile, felt the shift. Her rehearsed charm began to falter as Richard grew more distant. Her frustration turned to desperation. She tried to reclaim her grip with affection, with sweet words whispered at night, but the shadow of truth loomed between them. Grace noticed it too. She had no ambition to interfere in Richard's life, but her heart ached to see him deceived. Each time she saw Margaret's frightened eyes, she knew silence was no longer an option. The breaking point came late one evening. Margaret wandered the halls again, calling for her husband. Vanessa, dressed in silk, blocked her path. "Stop this nonsense," she hissed, gripping Margaret's arm with cruel force. "You're ruining everything for me." This time Richard heard it all. He had returned earlier than expected, his footsteps silent on the staircase. He stood frozen as Vanessa's venom poured out, his mother's tears streaming. "Let her go," Grace's voice thundered, rushing into the hall. She pulled Margaret away, her eyes blazing with defiance. Richard stepped forward, his voice low but cutting. "I don't need to hear any more." Vanessa spun, panic flashing across her face. "Richard, I can explain," but his eyes told her it was too late. The silence that followed Richard's words was heavier than any scream. Vanessa's lips parted, but no explanation would come. Margaret clung to Grace like a frightened child, her frail hands trembling against the housekeeper's arms. Richard stepped closer, his gaze unrelenting. "I saw enough," he said, his voice controlled but shaking with restrained fury. "I saw the way you gripped my mother. I heard every word." Vanessa's eyes darted desperately between them. "Richard, you don't understand. She provokes me. She confuses me on purpose. Stop," he interrupted, his tone final. "You think I don't see? You think I've been blind? For months, Grace has been the one caring for her, protecting her dignity. And you," his voice faltered as anger overtook him, "you pretended to be compassionate in front of me, while the truth was cruelty behind closed doors." Grace remained quiet, her arms wrapped protectively around Margaret. She didn't want this confrontation, but she knew it was inevitable. Margaret, still trembling, whispered, "She scares me, Richard." That broke something in him. He closed his eyes, fists tightening at his sides. When he opened them again, there was no hesitation. "This ends tonight." Vanessa tried to smile, a desperate mimicry of her practiced charm. "Darling, please, you know I love you. I've stood by your side at every gala, every meeting. You need me. I don't need someone who mistreats my mother," Richard said sharply. "I don't need someone who hides venom behind a smile." The argument drew the attention of staff lingering in the hall. A maid froze at the corner, her eyes wide. Even the butler, who had served the family for decades, hovered in the shadows. For the first time, they too were witnesses to the mask slipping. Vanessa's composure cracked. "You'll regret this," she hissed, her voice low but seething. "No one else will ever stand beside you like I have." Richard didn't flinch. "If standing beside me means destroying the one person who gave me life, then I'd rather stand alone." She gasped as if struck. "After everything I sacrificed for this future." "You didn't sacrifice," he snapped. "You calculated. You measured every move for wealth, for status. You thought you could discard my mother like an inconvenience. But she's not disposable. She's my family." The finality in his words left no space for debate. Vanessa's face hardened, the desperation in her eyes giving way to cold fury. Without another word, she turned and stormed down the staircase, her heels echoing through the hall until the slam of the front door rattled the chandeliers. The house seemed to exhale. Richard stood still, his chest rising and falling with the weight of the decision he had made. Grace eased Margaret into a chair, whispering soothing words until her trembling subsided. The old woman clutched her scarf tightly, rocking gently as if to comfort herself. Richard approached slowly. "Grace," he said, his voice lower now, "I owe you more than I can ever repay. You defended her when I wasn't here to see. You stood against cruelty when silence would have been easier." Grace shook her head. "I only did what was right, Mr. Campbell. Anyone would have—" "No," Richard interrupted softly. "Not anyone. Most people look away. You didn't." For a moment, the only sound was Margaret humming a half-forgotten tune. Richard watched her with tears gathering in his eyes. "She deserves peace," he whispered, "and I almost let someone steal it from her." The following day, the mansion was quieter than it had been in months. Vanessa's absence was palpable, like a perfume that had finally dissipated, leaving the air cleaner. Yet Richard couldn't escape the weight of realization. He had nearly bound his life to someone who treated his mother as a burden. At breakfast, Margaret mistook Grace for her daughter again. "You've grown so beautiful," she said softly, stroking Grace's hand. Grace smiled gently. "I'm not your daughter, Mrs. Campbell, but I'll always be here." Richard, sitting at the head of the table, watched silently. Something stirred inside him that he couldn't yet name, a mix of gratitude, admiration, and an unfamiliar tenderness. Later that afternoon, Richard gathered the staff. He stood in the grand foyer, the sunlight pouring through the stained glass windows. "I want it clear to everyone in this house," he announced. "Grace Johnson is not just an employee, she is family. And my mother's care is not to be questioned, ignored, or dismissed. Anyone who disrespects her will answer to me directly." The staff exchanged glances of surprise. Some nodded with quiet approval. Grace, standing near the staircase, felt her throat tighten. She had never sought recognition, but those words gave her a dignity she hadn't expected. But the story wasn't over. Vanessa's departure had not erased her influence. Rumors circulated in social circles. Some whispered that Richard had been rash, that he had thrown away the perfect marriage. Others, who had witnessed glimpses of Vanessa's cruelty, murmured that perhaps the truth was finally revealed. At one dinner meeting downtown, a business associate leaned across the table. "Richard, you ended things with Vanessa Moore. People are talking." Richard's jaw tightened. "Let them talk," he said flatly. "I'll not marry someone who disrespects my family." That same night, Grace found him in the study, staring once again at an untouched glass of bourbon. The fire flickered shadows across his face. He looked tired, older than his years. "She's resting now," Grace said softly. "Your mother had a calm evening." Richard glanced at her, his eyes softer than she had ever seen. "That's because of you." Grace hesitated, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "It's my job." "No," he said firmly. "It's more than that. You've given her what money can't buy, kindness, patience, dignity, and you've reminded me what truly matters." The words lingered between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Grace lowered her gaze, her heart racing. She had never imagined herself in this position, never thought the wealthy man she worked for would look at her with such intensity. In the days that followed, Richard became more present in the house. He joined Margaret and Grace for walks in the garden, listened to his mother's stories, even the confused ones, and slowly let go of the rigid control that had defined him for so long. Grace noticed the change. He laughed more, softened more, and for the first time, the mansion felt like a home rather than a monument to wealth. But Vanessa had not disappeared from their lives entirely. One afternoon, a letter arrived, its envelope sealed with her familiar handwriting. Richard opened it in the study, scanning the words with a frown. She begged for another chance, weaving apologies with veiled threats. She claimed Grace had poisoned Margaret against her, accused the housekeeper of manipulation, and warned that Richard would regret his choice. He set the letter down with a bitter laugh. Even in apology, she shows her true colors. He tossed the letter into the fire, watching the flames devour every word. Grace, standing silently at the doorway, caught a glimpse of his face. It wasn't relief she saw, but determination. The moment marked a turning point. Richard knew the battle was not merely about ending an engagement. It was about choosing who he would trust, who he would protect, and what kind of man he wanted to be. And though Grace said little, she knew the storm was far from over. The masks had been torn away, but in their place stood choices that would define all their futures. The mansion seemed quieter in the days that followed, though not empty. Without Vanessa's presence, the rooms carried a different kind of weight, a peaceful silence rather than a suffocating one. Richard spent more time with his mother, often joining Grace in the living room or garden, watching as she patiently guided Margaret through her shifting memories. For years, he had filled his days with meetings, deals, and the endless grind of maintaining his empire, but now he was learning to value moments that couldn't be bought or sold. One morning, Richard entered the garden to find Grace kneeling by the roses, trimming them carefully while Margaret sat nearby, humming a tune from decades past. Margaret suddenly looked up at Grace and whispered, "My daughter, you've grown so lovely." Grace smiled, as she always did, neither correcting nor dismissing the fragile illusion. Richard stood at the doorway, watching them, his heart tightening. The woman who had once been nearly invisible to him, another employee in his grand house, had become the center of his mother's fragile world. And though he hadn't admitted it aloud, she was becoming the center of his own. Yet outside the Campbell estate, whispers circulated like wildfire. At charity events and business meetings, Richard faced polite smiles laced with judgment. "You cancelled the wedding?" some would ask, feigning surprise, though gossip had spread the story already. Others shook their heads behind his back, murmuring that he had thrown away a perfect match. But Richard no longer measured his choices by society's approval. He had seen Vanessa's cruelty with his own eyes. Pretending otherwise was impossible. One evening, after a long day, Richard found Grace in the kitchen, softly singing while she prepared tea for Margaret. She looked up in surprise when he entered. "You shouldn't be working this late, Mr. Campbell," she said gently. "Richard," he corrected, "you've earned the right to call me by my name." Her cheeks flushed and she lowered her gaze. "It doesn't feel proper." "Grace," he said firmly, though not unkindly, "you've done more for my family than anyone else. You've carried burdens you didn't have to. You've been the daughter my mother remembers and the protector I failed to be. If not for you, I might still be blind." She shook her head. "I only did what anyone with a heart would have done." "Not anyone," he said softly. "Only you." For a long moment, neither spoke. The clock ticked on the wall. Then Margaret's voice broke the silence from the next room. "Grace, will you sing that lullaby again?" Grace smiled faintly, wiped her hands and hurried to her side. Richard remained behind, watching her go, feeling something stir in his chest that frightened and comforted him all at once. Weeks passed. Margaret's illness continued its cruel rhythm, some days brighter, others filled with confusion. But she was calmer now, more at peace. Grace's presence gave her stability, and in turn gave Richard hope. He began inviting Grace to join them at meals, no longer treating her as merely a caretaker, but as part of the household. At first, she resisted, uncomfortable at the thought of sitting at the same table as her employer, but Richard insisted, "If anyone questions it, they'll answer to me." It wasn't long before whispers turned into headlines. The press caught wind of the broken engagement, and journalists speculated endlessly. Vanessa, ever hungry for attention, fed the rumors by painting herself as the victim of betrayal. She claimed Grace had manipulated the family, that Richard had been seduced by a scheming employee. But her words rang hollow, and soon enough, stories emerged from others who had seen her cruelty firsthand. Her mask had shattered too completely to be repaired. Richard ignored the noise. His focus was clear now. One evening, as autumn winds rattled the windows, he sat with Grace in the study. The firelight danced across her face as she mended one of Margaret's shawls. Richard leaned back in his chair, watching her with quiet intensity. "You know," he began, "when my father passed, I thought I had to fill his shoes by becoming unshakable. I buried myself in work, in appearances, in control. But you..." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. You showed me that real strength doesn't come from power. It comes from compassion. Grace looked up, startled. I'm not strong, Richard. I'm just trying to do what's right. That's exactly what strength is, he said. The moment hung between them, fragile and unspoken. Grace looked back down at her hands, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never allowed herself to dream of more than survival, more than providing for her child and keeping her dignity intact. But in Richard's eyes, she saw a recognition she hadn't known she longed for. The turning point came on a cold winter morning. Margaret, in a rare moment of lucidity, sat upright in bed and looked between her son and Grace. Her eyes softened, clear for perhaps the first time in weeks. She's the one, she whispered, pointing to Grace. Don't let her go. Tears stung Richard's eyes. Grace clasped Margaret's hand, her throat tight with emotion. Rest, Mrs. Campbell. I'll never leave you. Later that night, when Margaret was asleep, Richard found Grace in the library. She was standing by the window, staring at the snowflakes drifting against the glass. He stepped closer, his voice quiet. My mother may forget many things, but even in her broken memory, she recognizes truth. She sees you for who you are. Grace shook her head. I'm just a caretaker. No, Richard said, his voice breaking with sincerity. You're the heart this house was missing. You saved my mother, and you saved me. Grace's eyes filled with tears. She had always been strong, carrying the burdens of others, but at that moment she allowed herself to be vulnerable. I never wanted recognition. I only wanted her to feel safe. And she does, he said gently. Because of you. Their eyes locked. For a moment, the distance of class, of titles, of expectations faded. They were simply two people bound by the same truth, that compassion, not ambition, was what gave life meaning. In time, the whispers of society faded. People moved on to other scandals, other stories, but within the Campbell mansion, a quiet transformation had taken place. Grace was no longer invisible. Margaret's fragile days were filled with warmth, and Richard had shed the illusions that once blinded him. The night that Richard finally thanked Grace openly in front of friends and family marked the true turning point. During a small gathering, he raised his glass and said, I once believed wealth was measured by power and possessions. I was wrong. Wealth is measured by loyalty, kindness, and courage, and no one has shown me that more than Grace Johnson. The room fell silent, then erupted in applause. Grace's cheeks flushed, her eyes cast downward, but inside her heart swelled. She had never sought to be noticed, but in that moment she realized her story was no longer one of invisibility. Her story was one of dignity, of courage, of truth. And as the fire crackled behind them, Richard looked at her not as an employee, not even as a savior, but as the woman who had reminded him what it meant to live with honor. The mansion no longer carried only echoes of ambition. It carried laughter, care, and the quiet strength of a woman who refused to look away from cruelty. And that was the legacy Grace Johnson would leave, not just for Margaret but for Richard and for everyone who would hear their story. So if this story moved you, take a moment now to subscribe, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs a reminder. True wealth is not found in money or appearances, but in the courage to protect the vulnerable and the heart to stand for what is right.